Hello, how are you doing? My name is Juan. If you're anything like me, you probably have a long list of classic books that you mean to get to one day. We're going to be talking about classic books today, so I would love for you to leave a comment with those classic books that you want to read this year. For my part, I'm going to share the 10 books I definitely want to get to this year. I'm going to be discussing the 10 books I feel I should have already read but haven't. And the first one is A Passage to India by Ian Forster. I love Ian Forster. I have read Howard's End a few times and also A Room with a View and Morris. And I would love to read everything Forster ever wrote. And his 1924 novel A Passage to India has been on my TBR list for decades at this point. I don't know about you, but when I have classics on my TBR, very often I push them aside because I am so confident that one day I'll get to them that I hardly ever prioritize them. And of course, that is a mistake because what ends up happening is that I actually never get to them. At the time of recording, I have already started reading A Passage to India, and I can say that I am enjoying it a lot. The novel is based on Forster's own experience in British India, and the novel deals with all the racial tensions in the country when it was still ruled by Britain. There are British and Indian characters, and the novel delves into the impossibility of friendship between the two groups because the relationship is not equal in the context of colonialism. A Passage to India is also a satire on the colonial government and English attitudes toward India and Indians at that time. It seems to me from what I've read so far that Forster was very critical of that. Another 20th century classic I want to read this year is The Castle by Franz Kafka. The Castle, or Der Schloss, is a novel from 1926. I have not decided yet whether I'm going to read this in translation or try to tackle it in the original German. By the way, I'm going to link to different editions of all the books I'm recommending in this video in the description box, just in case you would like to buy any of them and support my channel at no extra cost. I have already read what I think are the two most famous works by Kafka, The Metamorphosis and The Trial. From what I gather, The Castle shares the themes of alienation, arbitrariness, and ineffective bureaucracy with The Trial. And I must say that I've always found The Trial to be deeply disturbing and a bit claustrophobic, so I am bracing myself for The Castle. Kafka is meant to be one of the best and most influential writers of the 20th century. He has influenced so many different writers, including J.M. Coetzee, whom I really admire. So I would like to go into Kafka more and eventually read all his books. But if there is one classic that I am embarrassed not to have read yet, and that I want to make sure that whatever happens in 2022, I get to, that is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Again, Tolstoy is not a new writer for me. I love Anna Karenina and have read some of his other books, but never really found the time for War and Peace, which is notoriously big. I own this Oxford World Classics edition that weighs a lot and has tiny print. So I will probably find an ebook version and read it on my tablet because as beautiful as the cover of this tome is, I don't think my eyesight is good enough to focus on such tiny print for over 1,000 pages. I have heard great things about War and Peace, and I have managed not to watch any of the many film and television adaptations of it, so I only have a very broad idea of what the novel is about. I know that War and Peace chronicles the French invasion of Russia during the Napoleonic era, but I don't know anything about the characters or the plot of the novel. Another classic that I'm embarrassed not to have read yet, at least not in full, is In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust. Again, this is a huge novel. It is divided into 7 volumes, and I have read the first one 2 or 3 times already, but inexplicably I've never proceeded to read volume 2, let alone the rest of the novel. Proust is a hugely important writer. This is his masterpiece, and I really have no excuse. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to read 1 volume per month until I'm done with it. I know that some volumes are larger than others, so I am going to allow myself some level of flexibility here, and I might take breaks between volumes probably. But I'm also going to learn from my mistakes. I meant to read In Search of Lost Time last year in 2021, but I left it so late that when I started, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to finish it before the end of the year, so I just stopped reading it. And I don't want that to happen again, so I'm starting with it right now in January to make sure that I have enough time to finish it before the end of the year. There was a TV series that was an adaptation of Vanity Fair by William Thackeray recently, and I also remember an older film with Reese Reese Witherspoon in it. I never really got into those very much, which I think is the main reason that I haven't read Vanity Fair yet. At this point, I think I would have only read Vanity Fair before if it had been included in the syllabus when I was a student. But it wasn't. This is another novel set during the Napoleonic era, at least partially, and that is such a fascinating period of European history. Vanity Fair is also one of those classics that continues to be popular, so it clearly speaks to people now. And I want to read it mostly to find out why. What it is about this novel that people love so much and why it has never worked on the screen for me. I would love to hear from people who have read Vanity Fair, but I am hoping this is the kind of novel that I can really get into and have quite a satisfactory reading experience with. Another English classic I want to read this year is Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. This novel from 1915 regularly comes up on lists of best novels or best English language novels, and yet I realized as I was preparing this video that I knew nothing about it. But sometimes I like that because there is a certain kind of pleasure to be derived from going into a book knowing nothing about the plot or the setting. I am in two minds about this when it comes to classics though. Classics can be hard to read sometimes because of the language and the setting. It can sometimes be difficult to understand what you are reading if you don't have the right background or really hold the key to the text. It is very easy to feel completely lost when you try to read a classic knowing nothing about it. I'll give you an example. One of my all-time favorite books is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, and I read it the first time because I watched a TV adaptation of it and enjoyed it a lot. So when I read Jane Eyre the first time, I knew the plot, I knew the characters, and I still had a great time. But sometimes knowing the plot or the characters of a classic that I haven't read makes me feel I don't need to read it. And I know that is wrong because when I read Jane Eyre, even though I knew all those things, I had one of the best reading experiences in my life, which I have been able to replicate every time I pick it up again for a reread. Having said that, I'm going into Of Human Bondage knowing nothing about it other than its title and the name of its author. I have no clue what the novel is about, but I shall report back when I read it. I don't want this list to be too Anglocentric, so I'm going to talk about two French classics now that are, of course, widely available in English translation. The first one is L'Assommoir by Émile Zola, which is a novel from the late 19th century. I'm extremely underread when it comes to French classics, and while I'm not sure 2022 would be the year in which I go deep into French classics, there are at least two that I would want to make sure I get to. I want to read L'Assommoir mostly because I want to read something by Zola, and I have both heard good things about this novel, and I know that it is widely considered at least one of his masterpieces. But if you are versed in French classics and have a better recommendation for me, I'm also open to hearing it. And the other French classic I want to read is Les Liaisons Dangereuses by Choderlos de Laclos. I think this is the oldest classic I want to read this year because it is from the late 18th century. There are a lot of TV and movie adaptations of this novel, some of them made in English. I'm most familiar with Dangerous Liaisons, directed by Stephen Frears in 1988 and starring Glenn Close, John Malkovich, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Uma Thurman. But I actually prefer an adaptation that came out in '89 entitled Valmont, directed by Milos Forman and starring Annette Bening and Colin Firth. I haven't watched those movie adaptations in a long time, so I only have a vague memory of them, but I do remember I enjoyed Valmont a lot. And of course, there is another adaptation from 1999, which is fresher in my mind, which sets the novel in 1990s New York City. The movie is called Cruel Intentions, and it came out in 1999. It was directed by Roger Campbell and starred Sarah Michelle Gellar, Ryan Phillippe, Selma Blair, and Reese Witherspoon. The one thing that makes me a bit nervous, or even puts me off a little bit about reading Les Liaisons Dangereuses, is that it is an epistolary novel. So the novel is composed of letters written by different characters and addressed to each other. This is not my favorite kind of structure for a novel, and it was something that a lot of writers did in the 18th century. I'm glad that epistolary novels have not made a big comeback because I would dread to read a novel composed of WhatsApp messages. Although, you know, some novels use email a lot. I think using letters is okay as a literary device, but to have a whole novel made up of letters, I don't know. I'm also bracing myself for Under the Volcano by Malcolm Lowry. This novel first came out in 1947, and it is a day on the life of an alcoholic man in a small town in Mexico. But the novel doesn't happen on any random day, but on the Day of the Dead, which, as you know, is a big holiday in Mexico. I prefer my protagonists to be sober because I don't enjoy the company of drunk people in real life, so I don't see the appeal of getting into their minds through works of fiction. However, Under the Volcano regularly comes up on best of lists, and I feel it is a novel I should read. And as I said on the top, this TBR video is all about novels I feel I should have already read, and I am embarrassed not to have read. And that is definitely the case with Under the Volcano. I recently made a video with my reading goals for 2022, and I listed a series of authors I wanted to read this year, and one of them was William Faulkner. I have read a few novels by Faulkner before, but one that I have not managed to get to yet is Light in August from 1932. I understand that this novel has elements of Southern Gothic and literary modernism, which is not exactly what I enjoyed the most. However, one of my main areas of interest is Latin American literature, and Faulkner is a hugely influential writer in the region, most notably in the work of one of my favorite writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So I guess there's no escaping William Faulkner for me. With a title like Light in August, I feel like this is such an obvious book to read in the summer, so documenting my intention to read it in this video right now, it's also in part a way of trying to fix it in my memory that I should get to this book in 7 or 8 months time. You can touch the screen now for more classic recommendations and tips on how to read classics. I will see you again soon on my next video. Goodbye.